Use Your Head with Ethan Adler. Welcome to the newest episode of Use Your Head with Ethan Adler. Today, we have the most certified guest we have ever had. And I would like Cory Borup to tell you just a little bit about himself.
My name is Cory Borup. I am a teacher at Davis High School. I teach Spanish. However, my degree from college is in psychology, and as well as a master's degree in education. I teach Spanish here. I teach Spanish at Weber State 2 nights a week. And I also run the philosophy club here, and Ethan is a member of the philosophy club and asked if I would appear on his podcast, so I'm here.
Yep. How long have you been teaching at Davis High?
I've taught here for 13 years,
Yeah,
and I've taught high school for 17 years.
Yeah, and you've also taught college a lot. You're still teaching college now.
Correct, yes.
So let's get started with basically your area of expertise, education. What is the biggest problem with the education system right now?
I feel probably, since we're going to be talking about this topic, is the lack of thinking, lack of critical thinking, the check the boxes, mark A, B, C, or D, rather than learning to think for oneself or to develop theories for oneself or anything like that.
Okay. So this lack of critical thinking exists within the education system, and I think people have been trying to fix it for a long time. How come nothing's been done yet?
To be honest, I don't know. That's a good question, because in reality, we've talked about it numerous times throughout my teaching career. It's been brought up as something we need to focus on. It's been brought up that people in the community, businesses, colleges really want students to become more critical thinking as they go through high school. But we've tried little things here and there. But nothing has there's never been the critical thinking revolution that they've wanted to have come through the education system. It just hasn't happened.
Yeah. So why don't we talk about the status quo for a little bit? Because it's been a while since a lot of people have gone to school, and even people who are going to school, I think, have had the societal indoctrination of what you're learning is really important for you, even though some of the most successful people, Bill Gates and Steve Jobs, just to name a few, have made billions of dollars after dropping out of school. So what exactly is the status quo of education trying to teach?
Well, I hope I don't get in trouble by saying things, but I feel like we've become like a factory that is producing children that will go into society and be sheep, taxpayers, people that will wake up every morning when their alarm goes off, go to work their job, come home, sit in front of the TV, go to sleep, and do the same thing the next day, and never really question why or how, or even continue to learn after formal education is done.
Yeah. So what exactly is critical thinking, and why is it so important?
Well, that's a huge question, and there's tons of people that have tried to answer it, and there's been books written by it, but it's really, I think, a lot of it comes down to one's own personal belief in what critical thinking is. And my belief in critical thinking comes down to always questioning. So I was always raised, my father taught me from a young age the quote, it's better to debate a question without settling it than to settle a question without debating it. And I've always lived by that philosophy, and so I always think that we should ask who, what, when, where, why, and how.
Yeah. And
most importantly, how do we know that, and who's the one that found that, and those types of questions, and based on what other people have found, it's great to know what other people have found, but we need to develop our own philosophies on the world and our own philosophies on what is truth based on our knowledge that we seek to gain.
Yeah.
Not what someone has told us, but develop our own meaning of the world and around us based on our studies.
Yeah. So critical thinking is about forming your own opinions and not regurgitation. But much of the education system, I think, is based off regurgitation.
Yeah, for sure.
Would you agree as a teacher that especially if a child doesn't take AP or honors classes, they get no critical thinking in these systems of primary education?
Very little critical thinking. I don't know how much takes place at the AP level or advanced level classes either. I just think that we're taught to regurgitate information. That's basically, you brought that up before. That's what we're taught to do as students, is regurgitate. And I've shared the quote with the philosophy club before that no one would have you become a mere tape recorder of other people's thoughts. And I like that quote because that's what really education is you learn what someone else thought, and then you put on a piece of paper that person thought that. But what about what I think, or what about what you think, and your own personal studies? Those are what's important. I think that's where critical thinking comes in.
Yeah. And I think you're exactly right about that. And what critical thinking allows you to do is it allows you to be a more innovative person, a more creative person, and it allows you to have more ability within the political system to choose better candidates, and it basically makes everything about a society run more smoothly when its citizens can think critically.
Yeah, I mean, in essence, we've become like sheep. We've been led by someone in a lab coat. If someone has a lab coat on and they tell you what something is true, you're going to believe that thing is true.
Yeah.
Because of their situation, or if they have the word doctor in front of their name, or if they have some sort of title, some sort of power, position of power, then you believe what that person says.
Exactly. And they could just be lying to you for, well, basically any reason to gain influence, power, affluence. So I suppose the real question then, and one of the most pertinent questions, is how do we teach critical thinking?
I like to think of it as, like I said, asking the questions, simple interrogative words: who, what, when, why, where, how.
Yeah.
And when somebody explains to you how a motor neuron works, it's important for you to question, how do we know that?
Yeah.
And that goes with anything. If someone says, hey, this study shows this, that's really important, because what's one of the greater things that I learned in college is that when someone says, hey, look, this study shows this, then you can say, well, I need to see the study.
Yeah.
Because I need to see who were the participants, what was the control group, what kind of are extraneous variables, all of those types of things, because studies can show whatever the person doing the study wants it to show in reality. They can manipulate variables and things like that. And a lot of times what we're taught is based off of studies, especially in psychology. It's all based off of studies. This study was conducted, and so I like to break down that and say, well,
Let's look at
what's
the
the
actual
problem?
methodology.
Right. What's the problem with the study? Because there's no perfect study.
Yeah.
There has never been one. And so what's the problem with it? And just because that study shows this, there might be another study done by another person with a doctor in front of their name that shows something else.
Yeah.
And based on the two studies, then you come to a conclusion of your own opinion about what is real and what is truth.
So rather than saying this is what's true regurgitated on a test, we should say look at this study and analyze it.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that in education they've tried to go in that way. In fact, we're speaking locally of this new high school that's coming open over here, and their philosophy is that students are responsible for their own learning.
Yeah.
And I think that in theory is a good idea.
But it needs to start at a lower level, because by the time you're that age, a lot of them have already been built into that notion of where I don't care.
Right. Just give me the answer. Tell me what I need to know.
Exactly. Yeah. Give me a list of facts to memorize so I can put it on the test, as opposed to allowing you to really learn, because it really is much harder to think critically than it is to regurgitate information.
For sure. And people don't want to think critically.
Yeah.
There's a lot of people that don't. I've had experiences where people have said to me, I don't want to know that. I would just want to know what's on the test. Just tell me what's
Exactly.
on the test. And in the end, that comes down to the beginnings and grades, and the problem with having a letter grade
Exactly.
assigned to learning,
Yeah.
which the letter grade is supposed to represent how much you've learned in the class, but what it really represents is how well that student can play the system.
Yeah.
You know, how well maybe they have short-term memory and they can just regurgitate information that they've learned very quickly, and they don't really learn in that information.
Yeah.
They've just put it in their short-term memory, put it on a piece of paper, and jumped through the hoops. And that's
Yeah.
the biggest problem, I think, with education, is people have learned to jump through the hoops
Yeah.
and play the game.
So, I think it's intuitive as to why people don't like to think critically. It really opens you up to a lot of it opens you up to a lot of more negative thoughts when you're no longer just being entertained. And we're going to delve much deeper into this later in the podcast. But a question that I think we want to hit first is there a way we can affect the most base systems of education, kindergarten, first grade, second grade, as to make students in those levels learn how to think more critically? Or enjoy critical thinking more so because they've been taught it at a younger age?
It's got to start. If you want to have the revolution that you seek, it has to start at those younger ages. But at the same time, children at those younger ages are definitely, even more so than high school, not taught to
Yeah.
question.
You're right.
Don't question authority. Don't question what I'm telling you. This is the truth.
Mhm.
And so that would definitely be a revolution in education. And I'm not even sure how you would go about doing it, because I'm not a kindergarten or first grade teacher, but I am a parent, and
Yeah.
I believe I've tried to teach my kids to think critically.
Yeah.
That's the best that I can, and that's because that's how I was raised as
Yeah.
well. But it comes down to, it's more than just questioning
Yeah.
things. It's really just figuring out the world for yourself.
Yeah.
And I was taught in college class one time that children
Mhm.
in a child psych class are all their individual scientists.
Yeah.
And they go throughout the world and they develop
Yeah.
theories, and they put those theories into practice, and then they evaluate those theories, and then they change their theories,
Yeah.
and they go through the scientific process naturally
Yeah.
as children. I think that society, the way education works, is they suppress the natural scientists within children.
Yeah.
And once in a while, those children will be put in a place where they can be that in class, and they love it, and they go crazy about it, and they come home and they say, look what I was able to do in school. But that's not an everyday activity.
Yeah.
That's a once in a while
But
activity.
it really should be an everyday activity. And I think that by the time they reach, those higher levels of education, they've had this hate of learning beat down into them so much that they don't want to delve any deeper. Michio Kaku, who's a scientist, gave an interview once that I saw, and I thought it was very interesting because they were talking about the education system. And Michio Kaku had a daughter. And this daughter was learning about geology in school, and she had to memorize the names and types of rocks in this huge textbook and regurgitate them for a test. And she's trying to memorize, and she's having difficulty memorizing it. And she goes home to her father, who's, a famous scientist, a professor at the University of New York, one of the co-founders of string theory, and says, "Father, why would anyone want to be a scientist?" And he said that was one of the saddest moments of his life, because he realized that the way education was being done was ripping the joy of learning from his own child. And he went and he looked through the textbook himself, and nowhere in the textbook, he said, did he see continental drift, one of the driving forces of geology. Nowhere did he see any of the critical analysis. Nowhere did he see anything that really resembled what an actual geologist would be out in the field doing. How have we gotten to a place where education does this to children, where it has so little pertinence to actual thinking, when that's what it's supposed to encourage?
I think it probably began with the introduction of mass schooling. Putting 35 kids in a classroom versus I honestly, and you brought this up in class the other day with the way that people used to communicate and used to write, and it's so much better than the way it is now. But in the 1800s and early 1900s, when the local school was in that local community and everybody was within walking distance of that, and you had a lot of one-on-one interaction with people, and you had an opportunity to really bounce questions off of each other and have a community learning.
Yeah.
But now we have 38 kids in a classroom, and you go from one to the next. If you go to a major university and you take an introductory class, you're going to have 300 kids in that class.
Yeah.
You're never going to have the opportunity to bounce questions off of your professor, those types of things. That's a big problem. But I want to go back to what you were just talking about recently because of the joy of learning. Children have joy in learning, and I had this experience with my young son that's in 4th grade, and he was struggling a little bit this year with school, and his testing scores from previous years showed that he was on the same level as his peers. Well, he was struggling a little bit with school. School wasn't fun for him. In fact, he was dreading going to school every day. He would cry before going to school, and he would cry sometimes after school when he got in the car. Come to find out, his teacher was being mean to him. She didn't have very good classroom management, et cetera, et cetera. They were going to test him for special ed. And luckily, I have a lot of knowledge of special education, and I said to the teacher, he does not have a learning disability. Well, I contacted the principal. We switched him out of a class into another class with a different teacher. He loves school now. We went on vacation this weekend to St. George, and we hiked a cinder cone, which is a small volcano. And he just happens to be learning about geology and volcanoes. Well, he was on fire. I mean, he was happy as can be, picking up rocks, talking about what kind of rock it was, telling us all about all this stuff that he's learned in school. Well, that's a practical application to what he has been taught in school. So first of all, I bring that up because, one, you have learning was suppressed in a previous environment, and now that child is available to, or able to use his imagination and expand his horizons, et cetera, based on just a change in teachers. What about a child that's still stuck in that other class? Right? They're going to have that suppression still. They're going to hate school. They're going to go to school. So teaching is one that's huge. But the second one part of it is, like I said, when we went and were able to go and observe geology, that was huge for that child. And I think that that's why you find a lot of this homeschooling where children are homeschooled, and they, instead of going to a school and sitting in a class, they have opportunities to go to museums. They have opportunities to go to volcanoes and those types of things. And that kind of stuff doesn't happen. I can't take a group of kids to a museum in Mexico. But that's where real learning takes place.
Exactly. So that leads to the question, though, because there's not the resources within all of society to give every child that homeschooling quality education. The parents who homeschool are of greater affluence. The reasoning behind mass schooling is the protection of the disenfranchised, because we can't limit the opportunity of a child to learn because that child happens to have poor parents. And of course, the way the school system's funded still leads to that because it's funded locally. So if you grow up in a poor area, you're going to have a poorer school. But are there things within the methods of teaching themselves we could change in order to propagate this enjoyment of learning?
Hands-on learning, definitely. If the more hands-on the learning, the better it's going to be. I personally believe that if the purpose of education is to truly educate, and government funding for education should be used for that purpose, then the government funding shouldn't go to a lot of the things that it's going towards. It should be going towards kids being able to take trips and going out and observing geology and those types of things. It's just not being used for that. It's really difficult to get a field trip. I've tried to get field trips. It's very difficult to go on a field trip. There's a lot of hoops you have to jump through, and field trips that would be very, very educational.
Yeah.
And it just...
That the children would love and learn from. You can't do because why do they stigmatize against field trips? What's the reason for all these hoops?
I don't know. I don't know. One of the things that I do every Friday, as you know, is Culture Friday.
Yeah.
I feel like students learn a lot on Culture Fridays, but because oftentimes it's a video we're watching, there's a stigma that the kids aren't learning, or that I'm being a lazy teacher or something like that because I'm showing a video. Well, in reality, I'd love to take the kids to Bolivia and help them see for themselves, but we can't do that.
Exactly.
So the next best thing I have is a video that can show you a little bit about what things are like, but that's stigmatized.
I almost think it's appalling how revealing some of those Culture Fridays have been to certain people I know. I won't give any names, but I've had people, walk up to me because I'm in the Spanish class, and they've talked about the videos you've shown afterwards, and they've said, are children really treated like that? Is this how bad the world is? Right. And in reality, it's much worse than even those videos show. Right. Pew Research Center came out in 2011. 72% of the world makes less than $10 a day. Yeah. And it's absolutely appalling how few people, especially in the developed world, are aware of these conditions.
Right. And it goes down to there is no place where that type of video needs to be shown more than at this type of an environment.
Exactly.
Where people don't have a clue. And a lot of it is because they haven't been taught from a younger age that the rest of the world lives in a certain way. And that's true education, really. Education is not about A squared plus B squared equals C squared. Education really comes down to, in the end, what are you going to be a productive human being in society?
Yeah.
And I can be a productive human being in society if I can show compassion to my fellow man and help them progress along this journey of life, more so than if I know the Pythagorean theorem.
Yeah, most people forget it.
Yeah.
I believe most adults, probably a good 80%, don't know exactly how to do said mathematics because they've not had to use it. So
but they also don't know how to have compassion on their fellow men either, usually. So.
Exactly. So it's a large failure on the education system, isn't it?
It comes down to, yes.
So the real question then is, we don't have the money to take all... Do we have the money in the education system to, spend it on field trips, to spend it on this learning? And where is that money being spent badly?
I think the money is available, or could be available. There is a lot of money tied up in bureaucracy within the education system. And I have to be careful what I say, with this, but it is very top heavy in the education system.
Yeah.
And money could be used differently, that's for sure. And the government, the government has money. They have money. They could, if they wanted to revolutionize, but what happens is you get somebody put in a position of authority that doesn't really understand education or doesn't understand teaching. Most of the people that reach the higher levels in education aren't teachers anymore.
Betsy DeVos, our current Secretary of Education, has never been to a public school in her life.
Right. And it goes down even to local areas where usually people that are true teachers, that want to be teachers and believe themselves as teachers, stay teachers.
Yeah.
They don't go into administration or those things, and that's not always the case, but people are making policy who really don't understand education as far as learning or teaching.
So should we abolish these bureaucracies? Because what happens when you abolish these bureaucracies is now you have no systems to truly implement critical thinking, and you're trusting that teachers who have no oversight are going to stimulate the learnings of these children. Should we eliminate bureaucracy, or does it just need to be reformed?
I think it needs to be reformed. I don't think it needs to be eliminated at all. I think it's necessary. It's like you said, you have to have oversight. Otherwise, people will run rampant. But it needs to be different. Going back to the original concept of critical thinking, it needs to be where they don't say to teachers, you should try to implement critical thinking more in your classroom. And that's basically what it's been over the years for me. Hey, critical thinking is important. You should try to implement it more in your classroom. where there's no explanation of how you're
Exactly.
taught to how to do it yourself. And to be honest with you, critical thinking, I think, comes down to it's something that I think I can't remember the psychologist that came up with the levels of the higher order thinking at the moment, but
Yeah.
he's even the psychologist that came up with the higher order levels of thinking said that 80% of adults don't even reach that concrete operational, I think, is the highest order of thinking, if I remember correctly from my college days. But most adults don't achieve it. So if you have adults that are teachers that aren't critical thinkers themselves, how are they supposed to teach students to be critical thinkers,
Exactly.
right? So they're just jumping through the hoops too a lot of times,
Yeah.
trying to get a paycheck and
Yeah.
live life.
So we can't necessarily just trust parents nor teachers in general to be fully capable of teaching critical thinking when left on their own. So what needs to happen is basically an education revolution. Ken Robinson and others have called for this. Here's an idea. I mentioned this in our first podcast, actually. Of just an idea of implementing the Socratic method in earlier days of schooling. I think I may have talked to you about this before, where, say we're teaching geology. Rather than saying, this is a rock, it's metamorphic, this is a rock, it's igneous, this is a rock, it's sedimentary. We take a rock, we tell a child where it was formed, the conditions around the rock, around the time it was formed, to give them a limited amount of information about that rock, and then we have them figure out for themselves how that rock formed, and then we assign the name igneous to it. So we'd have groups of kids having discussions about it, trying to figure it out, and a teacher going around a classroom helping to guide these discussions. Do you think such a system would work?
Absolutely. I mean, that's my whole philosophy, is the Socratic method. In fact, I have a quote up there on the board that's from Einstein that says, "I never teach my pupils, I only attempt to provide them the conditions in which they can learn."
Yeah.
And I think that's true critical thinking, is what you mentioned. The Socratic method, where it's question and answer, where the teacher is a facilitator or a guide to learning and not somebody that provides information for students to regurgitate. That's the way it should be. But the problem is that people view the Socratic method as antiquity, ancient, and not, the old way of learning and those types of things.
Yeah.
And people think that it's not the correct way, and I believe that it is the correct way for learning.
It's learning through discovery.
Right.
Though I've given this topic to a lot of people, my idea of how to teach geology through discovery, and there's only really been one counter to it, and that's you have to cut the curriculum. Because if you say igneous, this is what makes it up, metamorphic, this is what makes it up, you can teach all of that in like 5 or 10 minutes, give them a paper, say memorize it for the test, and then move on. But if you do this learning through discovery, you're going to take half an hour to an hour to teach that concept. So you're teaching maybe a quarter as much as you were before.
But that's much more meaningful.
Exactly. And
that's exactly what you're trying to attempt to get, is the meaningful learning and not regurgitation.
Yeah. And if you look at at least the Common Core site, or the site for Utah Education and the curriculum it has, the curriculums for grades have a lot of repetition. If you look from one grade to the next, it's like, well, didn't the child just learn this in the previous grade? Well, maybe if we taught it through the Socratic method, they wouldn't have to be retaught it. So there's plenty of room in the curriculum for stuff to be cut.
Oh yeah, definitely. And like you said before, learning through discovery is what will stick in the mind.
Mm-hmm.
If you regurgitate information, it's just short-term memory. It's gone. And I believe wholly that that's the proper way to educate people, is through discovery. And the Socratic method is huge in my philosophy of education and learning.
Yeah. So is there a way we could implement this? Would we just have to restructure so the teachers are taught how to teach the Socratic method?
I think that a good teacher instinctively uses the Socratic method. I think that a lot of times, even when they're taught in college how to teach, which is silly to be taught how to teach,
Yeah.
right? But they're not taught the Socratic method as a way of teaching. But I think that a true teacher instinctively is going to go against what maybe a professor at a college says how to teach. Because the reality is most professors of college have never been in a high school classroom.
Yeah.
And I love my college professor that was my methods of foreign language, but he only taught 2 years of junior high back in the 70s. And he taught me how to be a teacher.
Yeah.
And he taught great things, don't get me wrong, but he hadn't been in a classroom
Yeah.
for many, many years. And so a lot of times teachers, professors of teaching in college aren't really teaching how to teach correctly.
So, just out of curiosity, and I think a lot of people would be curious to hear this, when you take that class in college to get that master's of education, what do they teach you? What methods of teaching do they tell you to implement?
Just different theories. It's a lot of a theory. It's theory, and again, this is the good thing about the Masters of Education. The Masters of Education was very helpful because what it really was at Weber State was a group of teachers collaborating a lot of times and coming up with your own ideas, and that's the way what we've been talking about this whole time. It was a true way of learning how to teach by bouncing ideas off of each other and whatnot. Methods of teaching a foreign language just went through the various methods of history, how the foreign language was taught in the 60s, how it was taught in the 70s, how it was taught in the 80s, and the different evolution of the teaching of foreign language. But the good thing is as a professional now, I can take a little bit of rote memorization, I can take a little bit of this theory, I can take a little bit of this theory, and then develop my own theory of teaching and teach the way I want it to be done, with a little bit of people at the top saying, well, you should do this, or you should do that, or you should do this.
But that needs to be greatly limited so that there's the freedom to teach children through discovery. And in fact, if there's something a teacher is really passionate about, the teacher should have the ability to impart that upon their pupils.
Oh yeah, definitely. It just a lot of times there's a little bit of pushback from above.
Yeah.
Even if the teacher, a lot of times teachers aren't allowed to be professionals, even though they tell us to act like professionals, or they say that we're professionals, but a lot of times we're not allowed to be professionals at the high school setting. It changes that when you go to the college, and that's what's good about, and what I love so much about teaching at the university, is they don't tell you how to teach at all.
Yeah.
They say this is what you need to cover, and you can do it in whatever way you want to do it. And they give you that autonomy, and that makes you feel like a professional, and it makes you feel, like I want to work harder at this.
Isn't it much harder to become a college professor because A, it pays more, so more people want to do it, B, you have that autonomy, so it's a better job setting, so more people want to teach it, and so what that does is it leaves you a lot of really good college professors, but how many really good high school teachers are we left? And that's not to insult high school teachers at all. A lot of high school teachers, many high school teachers I've had, have done it for the love of it, have done it for the love of their students, the love of imparting knowledge onto their students. But I do think there is a large number of high school teachers who aren't necessarily at the caliber they need to be.
Yeah, I think that's going to be at any level of anything. I've thought about that as well. I mean, you're going to have a guy working at a marketing firm that isn't isn't on the same level as his peers and those types of things. The only problem is with it is that at the marketing firm, that guy's going to lose his job. And once you enter the education system, and you get tenure, it's really hard to get rid of a teacher that's not a good teacher. It is a problem. And like I said earlier in the podcast, I had my own son had a teacher that I believe wasn't a very good teacher, and I got him out of that class. Excuse me. And I know that I've had teachers, even at the university, that I didn't feel were good teachers. But I think that there's benefits to having a bad teacher sometimes as well. in that you learn to say to yourself, well, I disagree with that. And you can say to yourself, well, I don't like the way that they are teaching, and I don't like this about them. And so you can use them as a model, as not
As
as
what not
you
to
not
be.
to be, in the future, and things like that. And it's part of growing up, because you're going to have to deal with people a lot in life that you don't agree with, that you don't get along with, and those types of things. So in that way, I don't want to say it's beneficial to have bad teachers. It's just, it's not as bad a deal as
Yeah, it's
as it
not
might be
as
seen.
bad a deal as some people would think. The system can handle a few bad teachers, and it might even be partially beneficial to an extent to have some bad teachers. But the number of bad teachers that exist right now, I think you'd agree, is an overabundance. So we need to limit it so that throughout your entire high school career, every teacher is an amazing teacher that engages you fully from kindergarten all the way through high school, except maybe for one or two.
Right. And well, the problem is like you brought up with the university. It's harder to get into a university because the pay is better. You have autonomy. You're treated like a true professional. So there's a hard enough time as it is retaining teachers and getting teachers into the education system based on, pay and all of that stuff. And so it's hard to attract the good teachers, and that's why you get a lot more bad teachers
Exactly.
in the education system as well.
So going back to a former point, you talked about funding a little bit. I think if a lot of teachers had more money and more freedom and just this ability to use the Socratic method, they'd be able to teach their students a lot better. I believe that a lot of teachers, even some of the worst teachers I've had, not the worst, but some of the worst, would be able to become amazing teachers given this, if they were taught how to teach the Socratic method, and if they had the funds they needed in order to implement some of the things which they as teachers truly enjoy teaching. So the real question is, where can we take the funds from? It can't just, bureaucracy is being overfunded, but I don't think there's enough in bureaucracy to take all of that money down to the base, is there? Is it that bad?
No, and people funding for education comes from a lot of it property taxes, and people don't want their property taxes raised. They don't. They would much rather have. They would much rather have their child go through school and have poor teachers and some good ones, and then come out in the end because they were okay, right? They're the parent, and they had bad teachers and they didn't learn very much. But in the end, I make money and I pay taxes and
Yeah.
I live a relatively happy life.
Yeah.
So my child, he can go through the same education system that I went through, because look at me, I'm just fine too.
Exactly.
And so people don't want to raise their property taxes because I think the actual benefits of proper education aren't seen by those parents. They don't see that, hey, my child could be getting a better education if I would be willing to pay a little bit more in taxes.
Exactly.
Anytime you mention raising taxes, I mean that person's
Yeah.
gonna, the poor political
Yeah.
people, they're gonna not get voted in.
Well, the U.S. already spends a lot per capita on education. It spends far more than some other countries, which are outperforming the U.S. by a significant margin. So there's probably enough money within the education system, but it's being allocated badly on textbooks and standardized testing. As a teacher, where do you think we should take this money from to devolve it to the level where teachers can take their kids on field trips, where they can buy the items needed to demonstrate some of the most beautiful things about the world around us?
I don't know where all of the money is available. I know we have what is called trust lands monies, and there's quite a bit of money in trust lands monies, and that could be something. And we have access to that,
Yeah.
but it's not to go on field trips and learn that way. Usually, it's used for something else like computers or
Yeah.
technology is big right
Yeah.
now. They're really trying to push technology in education, and so a lot of that money is used for that. You could,
Yeah.
I mean, Einstein, for example, didn't have a computer. didn't have, and he learned and used his brain and
Exactly.
those types of things. And I think technology is great. I like that I can use technology to teach, but technology isn't necessary for learning by any
Yeah.
means. Books are necessary for learning, reading, and teaching are all what really helps learning. And so you could use technology money for other things, I guess, if you wanted to. I'm not sure where money would come from. I just know that there's money available.
Yeah.
There's money available.
Yeah.
To say there's a lack of money, I think it's a cop out because
Yeah.
it's available if
Yeah.
they wanted it to be.
It's basically a ludicrous statement, especially considering the amount of money the U.S. government wastes on military.
Right.
They spent $17 million a few years ago building an Air Force base. I want to say it was Libya. It might have been somewhere else. And then they blew it up. They didn't use it once. They built it, and then a few years later, they blew it up. Just a waste of all of that money. And let's talk about something a little more localized and something that I think is going on quite a bit within systems of government. Last year, the junior high that I used to go to, spent $30,000. The foreign language department got together, and they spent $30,000 on something known as the language lab, where they have, you've heard of that?
Yes.
Where they have headphones that come down from the ceiling and you put them on and you can talk to your peers in Spanish and be recorded. They spent $30,000 on something they could have had their students do with a phone or a computer or resources which the school already had readily available. That money was basically wasted so they could have a cool thing that came down from the ceiling. How have we gotten to a place that's spending money this poorly?
It's I can't really talk about the language labs because I am, as you can see, I don't have one, but we have two of them in this school, and I have never taken my classes to them, and mostly because students don't like it. And it's obviously that you didn't like it very
Yeah.
well, and I've asked the students about it, and they all say, oh, we don't like that, and I don't like it because my goal as a teacher is to teach interpersonal communication. And speaking into a microphone to a student that's got headphones on that's across the room, that
Yeah.
defeats the purpose of
Exactly.
education and defeats the purpose of language to me and you speaking with a partner. So I have you speak with each other. You turn to the partner next to you and you speak. And that's the way language to me should be taught. Now, going back to the language labs, I had a lot of push from above to use language labs. Like, I need to take my classes and use them. I had to go to a training I didn't want to go to learn how to use the language lab because I needed to learn to use it. And so that is bureaucracy, right? That's
Yeah.
someone from above
Yeah.
who, and I don't know the situation, but somebody came in and said, hey, we've got this great product we can sell to your district and we'll do this, because that's what really happens.
And then they spend a lot of money.
money and they put it in the schools, and there's some sort of kickback probably for the person that agreed to purchase it in the first place, and I don't know that that's the case, but that kind of money, if you think about it, and what could have been done with $30,000?
You could have taken everyone in the foreign language department and you could have taken them down to Salt Lake City for a day to learn about the cultures of these people in
Right.
actual museums.
Right.
Or you could have spent that in immersion programs
Right.
that would have allowed you to speak in the language fully for a day.
Yeah.
That's a significant amount of money that was basically wasted.
Yeah, and people use them. Teachers use them. It's not something that I like to use. And the biggest issue for me with the language labs is that I was told, you've got to do this.
Yeah.
And that's not professional, right? We've talked about this throughout this podcast. That's not something that a educator that is professional should have happen to them.
Yeah.
You shouldn't be told from somebody, this is what you need to do. This is how you're supposed to teach your subject. Because I know how to teach my subject.
Yeah.
I've been doing it for a long time. And I'm trying to evolve all the time. I mean, I'm not set in my ways. I'm trying to evolve. and I should be able to choose whether I want to use that or not use that. So we have 2 of those language labs here. They wanted to put one in here, but I said that this wasn't the best classroom for it, and luckily it wasn't. But those are the kinds of, that kind of money is being spent on things all of the time.
Yeah.
So the money is available, the money is there, and it's used a lot for technology, and a lot of times it's technologies that is rarely used.
Yeah, it's wasteful. They might as well have spent that $30,000 on upgrading all of the computers so they aren't so slow anymore.
Yeah, you could have done that. There's a lot of things that you could have done.
Exactly.
There's a lot of things, going to Mexico, like you could go visit all the Mayan ruins in Mexico, and you could do that kind of thing with a little bit, not with government funding, but they don't, in education, we can't even propose such a field trip. You can't do any kind of fundraising for that kind of thing. You can't, all that stuff is frowned upon. And there's a lot of things that could be done that aren't done because it's frowned upon.
People don't believe that education can be enjoyable because their education wasn't enjoyable, and well, they turned out fine.
Yeah, right.
So there's an abundance of funds already within the education system. You could pull funds from other places that are already overfunded and wasting those funds. But there are already enough funds within education to create a good system. They're just being allocated badly. So that begs the question, and because I think you know a lot about it, I want to stick with the example of the language lab. Why did the administration try to push that so hard?
Well, it wasn't the local administration of that school. It came from the district level.
Yeah.
So it came from the district, and I think that they wanted to push the use of it because they purchased it. And it was an idea that said, hey, this will be great. And in theory, it is a good way to record, because it records students talking to each other, and you can go back and listen to that. But it certainly takes things away from teaching, where I can walk around the room and listen to kids talk and make sure they're on task and those types of things. So the push really came from the district level for that. And the person in the district that was kind of the one that headed that up.
Got it. Were there any advantages outlined to using these language labs over phones? Because you can have 2 people talking to each other and record themselves on a phone, and that saves you $30,000 that can be spent on so many other things.
Yeah, there wasn't really any of that. It was more like, we're going to have this training, you're going to come do it, and you're getting language labs, and you should use it.
Yeah, so it's a system that doesn't have any advantages over what presently exists. It's wasteful in terms of money, and in fact, you could say it has disadvantages compared to what already exists, because most students hate it.
Yeah. Yeah. But it goes with a lot. It's driven by money. It was driven by... We purchased this, and it was driven by someone came in and sold it, like a salesman came in and sold it, and therefore we spent the money on it, and you should use it. And that happens a lot. It happens a lot in education. iPads, for example. I mean, if this, how many iPads that have come through this school in the last 5 years, they're all over the place, and they're great. But I don't have them in my classroom. Other people do, but I'm really I'm just kind of an old school. Like I said, I believe old school. I think that I try to use like the Socratic method.
Exactly.
And when we've talked about philosophy and those types of things, that's what the great philosophers did, was teach using that kind of a method.
And if you look into the past a little bit, people, they read Homer for fun.
Yeah.
They read Dickens and Tolstoy for fun. Shakespeare wrote basically to the poorest of the poor. And they came and they saw him for the fun of it. And if you could do Shakespeare in modern day language, the same type of metaphors, the same types of personal conflicts and human truths, people wouldn't necessarily want to watch it because it's no longer fast-paced enough.
Right. But there's things that can be learned through reading of ancient books. I wouldn't say ancient, but they're ancient now.
Yeah.
that can't be learned in any other way.
Exactly.
And we just have gone away from that. And so in order for somebody to learn what's in that textbook, it has to be me reading the textbook,
Yeah.
taking out the things that I want to teach out of that, and then teaching the class
Exactly.
using that. Because no student's going to pick up a 1,000-page book and read it.
Yeah.
Not no student, but very
Yeah,
few nowadays
exactly.
are going to do that.
It doesn't even have to be a 1,000-page book, to be honest. I mean, there are some short. The Odyssey's not at that. It's like 500 pages, and that's reading a really bulky translation. The Republic's only a few. The Republic's like 500 or 600. There's Candide by Voltaire. It's like 90.
Yeah.
It's a tiny little, old, interesting book that no one's gonna pick up and read on their own.
Right. And it's not going to be used in a classroom setting in school either, because it's antiquated, right? It's not what I don't, it's not modern enough. And right now what if instead of buying a classroom set of iPads, you bought a classroom set of History of the Conquest of Peru?
Yeah.
And you had a classroom set of that, and then you sat down as a class and you read as a class this, and everybody participated and everybody learned, and then you had questions asked, and you
Exactly.
had conversations about this and that. That's where true learning would come in.
Or history through the eyes of different groups of people.
Right.
You could read something from the Babylonian texts and then read something, and I hate to say out of the Bible because there's a lot of conflict about religion. I'm not personally religious myself, but the Bible is history through the eyes of the Jews.
Correct.
And if you were to have some Babylonian texts very anti-Jewish and some Jewish texts very anti-Babylonian about what's going on in this time period, it would give you a really full view of the Semitic parts of Eastern Europe and Western Asia. And you'd have a really full view of history and a really full view of how cultures interacted. And you'd only have to spend a day reading some of these texts to really see what these different groups of people were thinking. But that's not going to help you regurgitate dates on a test.
That's right. And dates are, we can get in on dates. Dates are the least important thing in all of education. When did this happen, or when did this happen? But what you brought up was a great point, because if you were to read Babylonian texts and then read the Bible, and in class, then that student can come up with their own idea about
Exactly.
history. And if I read, History of the Conquest of Mexico by Charles Prescott or William H. Prescott, and then read the History of the Conquest of Mexico written by one of the natives who wrote that, then I can come up with an idea about true history. But those types of things don't exist. What we have is a history textbook that was written by some company that tells us this is what you're supposed to learn about history.
Exactly.
And oftentimes it's utterly false. And not just doesn't allow you for thought, it's just they're telling you things that historically are not correct, but have been made to be incorrect over the years by the telling of history by those who are the victors.
And the only real solution to this is to restructure education, which is why at some point I do want to call for a revolution. I don't think we have a large enough following now to really push such a movement forward, but such a movement should certainly be started, at least to start changing education at the lower levels, so people won't be forced to read textbooks in class, but rather they'll pick up the Republic on their own. So I'm going to give an example of someone I know, someone who I think is a really brilliant person, whose IQ must be, I have no idea how high his IQ must be. I mean, it's got to be like 160 or 170. I mean, he's reading Bastiat and Rothbard in high school. He's reading Bastiat and Rothbard and these economists and these complicated texts purely by choice. He's read Man, Economy, and State. It's a 1,000-page book by Murray Rothbard, and he's read the entire thing. He's an incredibly intelligent person. He has 6 Fs right now, hates school, skips class most of the time, and he doesn't really care about education at all. He's not sure whether he wants to go to college. And I'm not going to name him, but this is someone with a lot of potential who the education system has stigmatized, pushed away, and ruined his love of learning to the point where he's realized the education system doesn't matter. And what it's done is it's been absolutely terrible to him as a person. And I think a lot of incredibly intelligent people have been cheated out of the brilliance they could achieve through this system.
Correct. And I always use one example when this is brought up. I went to Weber State and graduated with my degree in psychology, and there was a student in my class. So there were probably about 4 of us that I would consider the top of our class that in psychology. The kid that was the top student in our class that graduated, he dropped out of high school as a junior and went and took his GED so he could get into college, started college, and found his love for psychology and got A's in all of his psychology classes. He went to Harvard as a graduate student, as a high school dropout. And he and I had conversations about that, and he felt like education was a waste of his time, the public education system.
Exactly.
So he's a pure example. I mentioned earlier my own son. My own son doesn't have a learning disability like he was told by this teacher. She didn't tell him, she told me that she thought he did.
Yeah, and you're a psychologist yourself.
Yeah.
You're a psychology major, so you'd probably know more about learning disabilities.
I knew he didn't have a learning disability, but he had been suppressed by the situation he was in. In reality, many times, my older son that's a senior here at this high school was once told in first grade, his teacher told us that we should put him on Ritalin because he was too crazy and this and that. And of course, we would never do such a thing. And he's a very intelligent kid. Will graduate from high school this year with 30 CE credits, great GPA, he'll be on the high honor roll, etc. But he was suppressed by the education system.
Exactly.
And so what you bring up a good point is there's tons of people that exist in the world like that. I myself was not a good high school student.
Yeah.
I was not a good junior high student. In fact, I barely graduated from high school. I had to take night classes my senior year in order to graduate because school to me was not fun.
Yeah.
But learning was fun. But school wasn't fun. And so I think what happens is that a lot of times students like the one you mentioned, they come to school and they see it as exactly what they don't want in life.
Yeah.
And so to them it's a pain.
Yeah.
And it's kind of like that saying, and I'll kind of mess it up, but if you judge a fish by its ability to climb a tree, is that what it is?
Yeah, it will think it's stupid.
It will think it's stupid.
Yeah.
And that's the reality of the education system. There are people who have, but I would say this also, that the biggest determining factor of success is whether a student feels like they're progressing in life.
Mm-hmm.
And so if they don't feel like school can teach them anything,
Mm-hmm.
they're not going to be successful in school because they want to be taught. And so I think that it's up to education to provide some place for that student to learn, to help that student. And hopefully that same student will take the next step like my colleague did in college and take to the next level and go to college at least. Yeah. If high school isn't for you, then at least go to the next level because there is critical thinking at the university.
Yeah.
There really is. That's where a lot of it takes place.
I know. I have a friend who definitely plans to go to college. He's taking several AP classes. He's gotten a 5 on every AP test he's taken. He's only taken the ACT once. I can't remember what his score was, but it was an incredibly good score. I don't think he has a single A. Maybe he has 1. Most of his grades are B's, B minuses. He has 100 missing assignments because he hates doing his work because he sees no point to it. And he aces almost every test he takes. And so many people like this don't have the opportunities to flourish at the high school level. And part of it, too, I think, is there's this idea of teach not necessarily to the lowest common denominator. I had a conversation about this with one of my friends the other day. Teaching to the, I don't think education is teaching to the least competent or the least hardworking, but I do think there's this idea of teaching to the middle, because you have these programs which I think help the not middle, which I don't want to say less competent, because I think they could be competent if they really tried to work harder, but they're trying to teach to the middle, and that stigmatizes the really intelligent, because they just want to keep running, they want to keep going, and there's this large middle which doesn't care about learning, and I think it causes those who used to care about learning to just want to drop back into the middle, because why care? That's who the system's built for.
Right. Yeah, I agree that there is a push to teach to the middle, because of a lot of it's because of test scores, because schools are graded on test scores, and so no school wants to have a bad grade, and so therefore we're going to try and help those kids that will help our school look better because of that. And so that's the biggest problem with test scores. And then again, that comes from the legislature. So the middle ground, the middle group of students are the ones who will help raise your test scores. If you can take them just a little bit higher, that will raise your school's test scores, and that's what your grades, your school grade is based on, is your test scores, your SAGE tests, and things like that.
And it doesn't really encourage the middle to become the top either, because what we want is for there in essence to be no middle. We'd love everyone to be brilliant, everyone to be reading The Republic in their free time, everyone to be reading Prescott in their free time. But the systems of education find it much easier to raise test scores by saying to the middle, here, memorize this, do all of this practice.
So how do we get the middle to be the great? I think that the key to that is to get them excited about learning.
Yeah, and that, again, has to start at the youngest levels, and that's why we need this revolution of education. And you as a teacher working within this system agree that it's stigmatizing true learning.
Yeah, I think so. And I don't think I'm the only one. I think that there's lots of teachers that would say so. But the best motivation is success. And so as a student starts to learn and really learning becomes more desirable for that student. And so, but the problem is that I think that, like your buddy you mentioned earlier, is a very intelligent student and reads all these amazing things, and he feels like education is holding him back. And then you have somebody that doesn't read all of those things but has a desire, because everybody has a desire for progress, and they also feel like education is holding them back. And then you have the kid at the bottom who doesn't really, he's got, all kinds of issues going on, probably at home, probably with all kinds of things. And then they feel like education is holding them back as well, the education system. So in essence, everybody feels like the education system is holding them back. And in essence, it very well could be. It very well could be. The way that it's structured, it very well could be holding people back. But that's not to say that teachers within the education system are trying to hold students back. And the education system isn't trying to hold it. It's just the way it is. It does hold them back, I think. From success.
I read The Selfish Gene the other day by Richard Dawkins. I'm not sure if Oxford still does this, but he talks in the introduction of how his education at Oxford was done through no textbooks. You find your own books, you synthesize your own information, you write your essays not using textbooks, but the writings of these authors you search out and seek yourself. You can have conversations with your professors and your peers about what the actual answer is, as opposed to letting a textbook think for you. And such a system really ought to be implemented at the high school level after we've implemented critical thinking at lower levels of education. And one day, I'd really like to set out a plan that outlines this is what should be done in the lower levels and moving on to make everyone, brilliant regardless of their parents' socioeconomic status. And hopefully, I do think that will be done one day. But I think you'd be in favor of such a system.
Yeah, I think as anybody would, you just have to find the right people to implement that. And so I think I mentioned to you before, like my father is a huge critical thinking guru, and he has written a huge textbook about it, but yet, and he's taught a class at the university, at Weber State University, on critical thinking, but yet he's never been asked to address a faculty on how to do it.
Exactly.
And what kind of thing. And
Exactly.
other people have. I have sat in a faculty meeting before and had somebody come and try to talk to us about critical thinking, but it wasn't very effective.
Yeah.
And so I think what happens is there's a lot of red tape that people, it's not about what you know, it's about who you know. And so when someone is asked to think, if a faculty needs to be addressed on critical thinking, they're going to bring in their buddy who knows something or other about it. And so I think that it can be done. It just has to be done correctly. You have to get the right minds in there.
Exactly. So that just begs the question. I think everyone's really curious because so few people really go to these faculty meetings. It's only teachers. So few people know how exactly the education systems, especially at its most basic levels, are run. What did they go up and talk about when they tried to teach you how to teach critical thinking?
Not much, I guess. I don't remember, obviously, so I don't remember exactly their methodology and what they, but that was when we got those Dursels over there, that desired results of student learning, and critical thinking was the number one thing that they wanted us to do. And that was when they brought it up. But I think that you bring up a good point, that when you go to faculty meetings, the people that are in faculty meetings are teachers. And there's not student representation. And I think that would be something that might be something that could start this revolution that you're talking about, is having students come and say, this is what I want in my education. And maybe not come to faculty meeting, but students should be able to speak out and have a forum to say, I would like this more in education. We would like this more.
Yeah, but students are sort of stigmatized against almost. I think that a lot of teachers sort of dislike their own students because, would you agree with that some teachers certainly dislike their own students because they give them so much trouble. They can be a real headache, or at least some of them. And I think that causes a lot of teachers to say, no, I don't want students in our faculty meetings. They're going to mess it up. This should be, it's adults talking now. Let's keep the kids out of it. When really you're keeping the people who you're affecting out of it. When you're keeping the people who you want to help from saying how they want to be helped.
Yeah, and I think that's what you have, the reason why you have student body officers. Those people have some authority within the school and ability to make some change. But I don't know the answer to, do certain teachers dislike students? I'm sure each teacher is different, but I do know that I have heard from students before that when I talked to them about you should be asking questions like who, what, when, why, where, how, like we've mentioned before, that students say, well, their teachers would get angry with them if they ever questioned what they were being taught. And so, and I don't think should be the case ever. I know that when I was in college, especially in my biopsychology class, I would ask questions all the time. How do we know that?
Yeah.
And the teacher was great. She was one of my favorite teachers I ever had, and she was great to tell us, this is how we know. And and actually we don't know, but there's a theory. And those types of things. And that's really important for people to understand, is that when someone asks you a question, why and how do we know that, they're not questioning your knowledge. They're just questioning in general. And it's good to question.
Exactly.
So I do know that students have told me before that teachers don't like it when they ask questions like that.
Yeah. That really becomes a problem. So as a teacher and a member of these faculty meetings and what you've seen, faculty meetings, would you agree, aren't nothing really happens. Nothing productive happens very often. Is that true?
I wouldn't say it's not productive. Most of the time, faculty meetings aren't really about how to teach and those types of things. Very, very seldomly do we have like a situation where I mentioned earlier where they brought someone in to talk to us about critical thinking. That happens very rarely. Faculty meetings are more about getting information out to the faculty. We're going to have a fire drill this day and those types of things, and it's not an educational setting
Exactly.
where we are given instruction on
Exactly.
teaching practices. That's not what a
Exactly.
faculty meeting is.
It's not about helping the students. It's just about, keeping everything organized.
Yeah, and I think that one of the things, my voice isn't ever really heard, but I think that it would be important and it would be a good idea to, and this is just a thought that I've had, but I've never taken it to anybody anyway, but they should have teachers at times come up and teach the faculty.
Mm-hmm.
Give us your best lesson. Everybody's got, a lesson that they give that's your best lesson. What's your best lesson? Teaching practices and things like that would be
That's a good idea.
an idea where, we can learn from each other teaching skills and those types of things. But that happens rarely.
Yeah, and the real problem is how do you implement something like that? Or even something with as small as giving students the voice, the ability to say, no, this isn't working. Please do this instead. How do you start something where you give students the voice?
I don't know. I think because you brought up earlier, there's a lot of people that are going to look at students as, well, they're just students. They're just high school kids. They don't know what they're talking about and those types of things. And so I think that there's not too many people interested in what the students want.
Exactly.
Like they're more interested in just either what's easiest or what's come from above.
Exactly.
Or, what they're used to, those types of things.
Yeah. So what really, I guess, needs to happen, because people have tried to do this from above before and it's not worked, what I suppose would need to happen is the students themselves and teachers who believe in this need to rise up and say a change needs to happen. There should be a true revolution in thinking within education that starts from students and teachers, that ricochets all the way up to the top until the system is forced, not from the top down, but from the bottom up, to entirely restructure itself.
Yeah. I mean, in revolutions, anytime there's a revolution, it's got to start from the grassroots and work its way up. You're gonna encounter all kinds of, opposition. That's for sure to anything that's a new idea, but I've thought about it a lot. I just don't know how to get there. And so what I've done really is just tried to have my own personal revolution within my classroom.
Exactly.
I try to encourage critical thinking in the ways that I know how to do it. And it's hard with Spanish language because there is some critical thinking involved in Spanish, and I use it to the most of my ability, but I wish I had a forum, and that's why I've always wished I could teach a psychology class or something like that where I could really communicate ideas to students and have good philosophical
when a teacher desires to teach critical thinking, the administration's almost scared of it.
In true form, I would say so. Yeah. I don't know about administration, but somebody would be scared of it in its true form. But I know that, like I said, we've got these dorsals that say critical thinking. If you look at the place where they call it the stoop, just down here at the bottom of the stairs, there's something written there about critical thinking. And so it's something that's preached all of the time.
Exactly.
It's just not something
that's been implemented.
A lot.
So who's going to be scared of critical thinking? At least in my opinion, part of it is the parents don't want their kids exposed to Republican ideas or Democrat ideas if they're members of the other party.
Right.
And I think it's parents who are like, no, don't show my child these other views because I want my child to think like I do.
Right. That could be too. Yeah, that definitely could come from the parents. And so, and that's, I guess when it comes down to it, we've talked a lot about this throughout this whole podcast, is that there is resistance to change all of the time. I think in anything there's resistance to change, and there's various reasons why there's resistance to change, but everybody can do their part in bringing about that change.
Exactly. And this is a change which really, truly does need to happen. So let's tie this back finally, because I always believe that the final level of analysis in any classroom setting should be, how does this affect the real world? So take history, for example. Even the hardest history class you can take at the high school level is AP World History. And in that class, you rarely tie anything to the modern age. They give you these different essays to write about why trends in the past happened, but they don't say what the modern era can learn from this. They don't say, how can we implement this in today? How can we make it so that America functions or the world functions better as a whole? How do we avoid the mistakes of the past? That's not done very often, I think, in any classes. So taking this podcast to that level, what's the manifestation of people not being able to think critically? As in, because we aren't teaching critical thinking? How is this a detriment to society as a whole?
Well, I think it comes to what we're going to talk about, the fact that people are sheep because of it.
Exactly.
And so you can be told anything that you want, you can be manipulated. Your mind is literally being manipulated by what you see on television, what you hear on the radio, the music that you listen to, all of those things. It's created this fake world, basically, of lies and deceit. I wouldn't say lies, but sometimes lies and just deceit. I would say deceit is the correct word.
Yeah.
Where you can say anything to anybody and they're just going to take it at face value because they've never been taught to question that.
Exactly. And so what that does in the real world is it decreases innovation. It ruins your political systems because all people want is entertainment. So this goes back to like a book which Neil Postman wrote called Amusing Ourselves to Death, in which he detailed the stigmatization of intellectualism because people loved entertainment, they loved watching TV, and it was much easier to let the TV think for them than to think for themselves, and education never really fostered them thinking for themselves. And he predicted that if these trends continued, we would one day have a reality TV star as president. And we have a reality TV star as president.
Yeah, people want entertainment. That's what truly...
Yeah.
And I think that, if you turn on CNN and turn on Fox News, it's really become entertainment.
Exactly.
It's become almost like a freak show. I shouldn't say the word freak show, but it really has become that, where all... And I think that they have realized that, the producers of these shows, whether it be CNN, Fox News, MSNBC, whatever, the producers realize that they're gaining viewership by putting on this weird kind of freak show, and that's why it has continued. If everybody turned off their television like, this is bogus, I'm not going to watch this anymore, it would force them to change it.
Exactly.
But everybody likes that entertainment. They want the drama.
Exactly.
And so, that's based off of this concept of people are not free thinkers anymore.
Yeah. And people don't want to think about the bad things that are going on in the world. So let's really dig this down into the deepest level of its manifestation in the real world. Let's go to that, to the core of what it does to each individual and how what it does to each individual really ricochets out. Because not only is it stigmatizing against innovation, not only is it ruining the political system, creating top-heavy bureaucracies, inefficient systems, this lack of critical thinking experienced by most people, but it's also keeping them in this sort of fake world. You have a sort of matrix analogy, which I know you like to give to your students to encourage them to think about it and think critically. Would you mind going over that right now?
Well, it's kind of what we've been talking about this whole time, basically, is that the truth of all things is out there for people to find. And in order to find that truth, you have to be a seeker of the truth. But people have been manipulated, or their minds have been conditioned to not seek truth, but rather just regurgitate information. And so what's happened is that they've taken all of that and they just accept all of that information as truth. and what that information that they've been given is not the truth, and so it's created like this matrix, like based off of the movie. And so, and the real truth is out there, but the people have been blinded from the truth by this matrix that's been created. And so, in essence, it's really what we've been talking about this whole time, is the fact that people can't think for themselves, and therefore you can be told what truth is rather than seeking truth for yourself. Yeah.
So there's no real conspiracy here to suppress the masses, but there is the masses being provided through what society provides the masses the means to suppress themselves, and they make it easier for society and people to hide themselves from the truth than they do to make it easier for people to seek the truth. So people are, in essence, conditioned to hide from reality itself. It creates this sort of fake entertainment world where people don't want to acknowledge what's going on in other parts of the world. They don't want to acknowledge that, well, let's just be honest here about where most of our products come from. Foxconn, the manufacturer for Apple's iPhones, put up suicide nets because their workers were literally killing themselves. Children, millions of children, starve to death every year. People work in Bolivian mines so that we can have cheap minerals, cheaper jewelry. People work stitching our clothes in Vietnam, Cambodia, Laos, so that you can go to Walmart and buy a shirt for $5 as opposed to $10. And nobody wants to acknowledge this because it's much easier to just sit down and watch the TV. And what it's doing is it's causing those problems to remain unfixed because no one wants to look at those problems.
Yeah, nobody wants to see the truth, that's for sure. Exactly. Especially when the truth is hard. And, you brought up various instances back in the late 90s and mid-90s. There was the blood diamonds coming out of Africa, and there was all kinds of things going on there, but nobody cared. They just wanted their diamonds.
Exactly.
And if you told me, oh, but did you know that your diamond came from this in this particular situation, people were like, oh, don't tell me that. Don't tell me because I just want my diamond. And so it's just like you said, where nobody wants to know the ugly truths out there. And if they did, would they change their behaviors? Or would they just accept it and just and go on about their business? So that's part of the matrix, I think, as well, is that once you understand the truth, are you willing to change your habits and behaviors because of the truth?
Exactly.
Or are you going to just stay in the matrix?
Yeah.
And in that movie, there's a character in particular that he decides that he likes the matrix better than being outside of the matrix.
Most people seem to like their entertainment. Why not sit down, watch the television, keep up with the Kardashians?
Yeah.
Look at what Justin Bieber is doing. Look at LeBron James. And, forget about the world's issues. The world's been here a while. You can just relax, do your job. You've never been taught how to think critically. Education doesn't really do that, but you've turned out well enough. You're making your money.
Right.
And you want your kids to do the same. But in the end, it's really not good for you, anyone as a person, to do that, to hide themselves from what's actually going on. And it's especially not good to keep your children from learning how to think critically and making them live a lifestyle like that. Because whether or not education is entertaining, whether or not you enjoy what's going on, what has to be admitted is that education is more fulfilling than entertainment. Learning, reading The Republic, reading Plato and Socrates never wrote anything, but, reading Voltaire and Nietzsche, when you read these people, you are growing and progressing yourself as a person. And when you sit down and watch Keeping Up with the Kardashians, you don't really progress as a person, you're just being entertained. And in the end, that's far less fulfilling, and you'll become, I think, a less happy, a less joyful person if you don't learn how to think critically. And I think that's a real effect that happens to people's kids. And I think that's really why we need to change the system. That's why a revolution needs to happen.
Yeah, I agree. I agree, because the truth is that knowledge truly is power. Knowledge is power. And you've heard it before, everybody's heard the saying, but that's the truth. And what you bring up, I teach a lot of times, is that progress is essential to human happiness. And when people are not progressing in life, that's when depression sets in. And we find our society full of people who are depressed individuals. And a lot of those individuals, not all, but I'm kind of painting everybody with a wide brush here, but those are the types of people that are, like you said, sitting down and watching Keeping Up with the Kardashians and watching all these entertainment shows and those types of things, rather than sitting down and reading a book and learning.
Exactly.
Because progress is what you want in life. Everybody innately wants this progress. And that goes back to one of these psychologists, Alfred Adler, talks about that everybody innately wants to grow and increase and develop. And lack of that is going to lead to psychological issues.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So the only way, in essence, I think you'd agree to break people from this matrix is to start at a young age. Would you agree with that? There's no way, if you're an adult and you want to be entertained and you don't care about this, there's no real way society or any system can come in and free you from that.
No, yeah, it has to start at a young age. And I think that you can do it in a very secular fashion. You can really do it by just introducing at a young age simple philosophical concepts. It's not hard for someone to learn philosophy at a young age. You don't have to study really deep philosophy, but very basic philosophical concepts can be taught at a young age. Teach people to think about the world around them, because I think that they do. I think that children think about the world around them and how it functions all the time, and they're just never given a forum or a way to talk about it with somebody.
We stigmatize against that.
Yes. Yeah.
Because, just be sheep.
Right.
Live your life, make your money, pay your taxes. And it's a huge detriment to all of society, and I think it's sort of leading into a Spenglian decline of the West, a Spenglian winter that's causing us to flock, due to our affluence and our abundance of wealth, we're flocking to entertainment. And because of this flocking to entertainment with no one carrying or watching over systems of government, systems of public institution, the entire system itself will become corrupt and collapse. Here's an example I like to give, and I think everyone would agree with this. You can walk in to almost any room full of people in the world, a stadium full of people, and say, raise your hands if you've heard the name Xi Jinping, Angela Merkel, Theresa May, Rex Tillerson, Tom Price. These are people, and I think you've heard of them, who are controlling the world, who are pushing the global agenda. They're not hidden. There are no conspiracies. You can look their names up online. You can know exactly who they are, the powers they have, the responsibilities granted them. And almost no one knows who they are, despite the fact that they're running the world. But if you say, raise your hand if you've heard of LeBron James. Raise your hand if you've heard of Miley Cyrus, Steven Spielberg, Tom Cruise, or any other number of celebrity. Everyone in that stadium will raise their hand for pretty much every single one of those people. There might be a few non-pop culture interested exceptions, but that's the general trend of society, and that really is proof of the manifestation of this analogy you give.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely. Everybody's become so fixed on, I don't know,
They've become so fixated upon entertainment, I think is what you're trying to say, that they don't terribly care much anymore about anything else.
Right.
Because they've never taught that other things can be more fulfilling, that other things can in essence bring you more joy than this mindless entertainment.
Yeah. Well, I know I've had students before that are so obsessed with Beyonce that they think that she, like, if Beyonce wrote a book, that would be their Bible.
Yeah.
Like, that's how much they thought Beyonce was the most important person in the world. And that's a lot of these students. A lot of these students are like that. I have a student that I can't even remember the name. He was some rapper. He had a book that was a biography of some rapper that he was reading, and like I was kind of blown away by it. Like, that's what you chose to read, and it was a long book, but that's what you're going to read, is this biography about some rap star, rather than somebody, you know, that was a true, like, amazing philosophical
Exactly.
person in history.
Yeah.
And so that's where we've come to.
Exactly. I mean, I kind of want to make clear that this isn't really an elitist stance, because you can, if you think this rapper is an interesting person who brought himself out of, the oppression of growing up in, some poor inner city neighborhood, maybe that could be an interesting biography. But you shouldn't care about that rapper so much that you take his words about the economy, his words about life, over the words of an economist, or his words about life over the words of a philosopher.
Right. Or if you're going to read that book, that's great, but read this other book as well.
Exactly.
Right? And that's the point I was trying to make, is that most people are stuck, and we've just
they just care about celebrities.
Yeah, celebrities.
It's this worship of celebrity culture, as opposed to those who actually run society. So how have we gotten to a point where the Matrix exists? I mean, if you read Juvenal, the Roman poet, he talks of panem circuses, bread and circus, controlling the people of Rome. As in, you play the gladiatorial games in the Colosseum, you give the people of Rome their bread. Well, they'll be okay, whatever you do, it's fine. So this is keeping in line with your analogy from 2,000 years ago. So has technology made this worse? If so, how? And is there a way, if this has been going on for a long time and getting worse, is there a way to really fix it?
I think that in that instance, the revolution has to be individual.
Okay.
I think that you can touch as many people as you want and teach them the truth. Definitely, technology has made it so that you have, instead of one Colosseum in Rome, you've got 10,000 Colosseums available at all 24 hours a day for people to find entertainment.
TV stations.
And so people, the same principle is the same, but you also have it now available and in such an abundance to everybody. And so that's my purpose with teaching students about the Matrix and stuff, is that I'm trying to help everybody understand that it's an individual choice to say, I'm going to rebel against that. Yeah. And not to say that I don't watch basketball once in a while or something like that, but at least recognize what it is, that it is what it is, and recognize that it's entertainment and not life. And so, one of the things that I always try to teach, and this goes back to Spanish, and that there's a word in Spanish for fun, and it's diversión, which is the English word diversion. And fun is diversion, and not necessarily meaning that it's bad, but you have to understand that fun is not, and entertainment is not what you exist for. You should exist for progress.
Yeah, it's hard to know the Latin roots of that, but maybe that stretches back all the way to Rome of, it's a diversion for the people, the Colosseum, this fun, this panem et circuses, this diversion.
Yeah.
There's no real way to tell, but that certainly would make a lot of sense. So, I suppose then, if technology has exacerbated the problem, and the trends show this problem getting worse with time, this matrix getting worse with time, you're saying that these trends don't need to continue, and that we can stop these trends by fostering an individual revolution?
Yeah. And that's why I say it has to happen at an individual level. So as many people as you can reach through your podcast or through my teaching that can help people understand that the true happiness in life is found in progress and learning, and not just progress of the mind, but progress of everything that is you, your physical body, everything. Progress leads to happiness, and the lack of progress leads to the opposite of happiness, which is depressive states and things like that, psychological issues. And most psychologists would agree with that. If not all psychologists, I'm talking about theorists, the older theorists of psychology. And so and it's a huge problem in our society right now, is people being depressed. And so put the TV down and start grabbing a book and start learning, and you'll find that you'll be a happier person because of it.
Exactly. But people have never really been taught that, and then
No.
they lean into what's easiest.
Right.
And we've been calling for this revolution over and over again, but that's because it is this education revolution which I think can solve maybe not every, but 95% of all the problems society has.
Yeah, oh yeah, for sure. You think about it, if there's a society that existed, that everybody read books and progressed every day and made it a point to progress every day, and
Yeah.
you would have a completely different society, that's for sure. It would be a much happier group of
Exactly.
people.
Well, if anything can be learned looking at history, it's people who propagate such ideals, who try to take, who try to take entertainment away from people, or at least if they try to break the illusions of society, if they try to break this analogy of the Matrix. When people try to break that, they're often, stigmatized, to use not a very powerful word, I guess. I mean, they're killed in some instances. If you take a look at Socrates. Socrates went around basically, and you had the sophists who were saying, give me money, I'll tell you how to live life. And people were living in this illusion of Greece where they accepted this, they accepted the Greek gods, the Greek city-state, the Greek systems of Athens. And then Socrates came along and said, here's, think about it. I mean, if you listen to what Socrates himself said and what Plato wrote when Plato wrote about what Socrates said, you can see that, Socrates did believe in the Athenian gods, but he wanted students to think for themselves. Well, I don't want to use the word students. He wanted people, all people, to think for themselves and come to that conclusion on their own. And because he wanted people to come to that conclusion on their own, because he wanted people to think critically, because he said, break these bonds, look at the truth, see the world for how it is. The people of Athens, the democracy of Athens, killed him. And this is why Plato hates democracy.
Yeah, you would definitely find a kickback from those powers that be, that's for sure. They don't want you to speak out against it, right? They don't want you to speak out. So, but it's necessary to do so.
Mm-hmm.
Definitely. But again, I would just say that I think that the revolution is individual, and if you start there and then band together afterwards, you never know what kind of change you can make.
And that's exactly what needs to be happen, especially in a day and age where, this Matrix is worse, perhaps, than it was in ancient Greece, but they can't kill you for breaking it anymore. And that certainly is a good thing. So I believe that you have to go now, but that's been a very good podcast. It's been great talking to
Thank
you.
you.
Hope to have you on sometime again, maybe.
Yeah.
And to all of our viewers, remember to think critically. Don't just listen to anything we've said here and regurgitate it as your own. Think about it and form your own opinions. And remember, each of you can have your own individual revolution. Thank you.